Joanne from ArtResin, and today we're talking about sanding resin. Now, if you've worked with resin regularly, at some point you've likely had to sand your resin. This can be necessary for lots of different reasons, including removing imperfections from the resin surface, like dimples or dust or bubbles. You might be sanding to remove an uneven surface or softening a sharp edge. Both of these can happen if you're pouring resin into molds. Sanding is also necessary if you want a thicker resin coat and you're adding a fresh resin layer onto cured resin. And finally, you might prefer a matte look instead of resin's usual glossy finish. This can also be achieved by sanding. I'm making this video because I've been there and I totally understand how nerve-wracking it can be to take a piece of sandpaper to your cured project. One thing you need to know is it will look destroyed at first, but I promise you it won't stay that way. So today I'm walking you through everything you need to know about sanding resin, including best practices and tips to help you build up layers, create a matte finish, or fix mistakes for perfect professional results. So let's get started. First, let's go through all the tools that we'll need for sanding resin. Now, the first and the most important thing you'll need is a dust mask. This is going to prevent you from inhaling all of those fine dust particles that you create by sanding. The next thing you'll need is a pair of safety goggles, and this will prevent the dust particles from getting into your eyes. And you'll also need a pair of gloves to protect your hands. I really like these heavy-duty nitrile gloves that I get from the restaurant supply store. They'll last a little longer and withstand sanding a lot better. Now, the next thing you'll need is sandpaper, of course, but which grit is best? We get asked this question all the time, and it really depends on what you're sanding and why you're sanding. For most purposes, a coarse sandpaper, anything between 80 to 120 grit will work just fine. But there might be instances when you need a finer grit, or if you're sanding to create a matte finish, you'll need wet, dry sandpaper in a variety of grits. But we're gonna get to that part in just a little bit. Now, I normally sand by hand, but an electric sander is great if you've got a really big piece of art, or if you've got a piece with multiple layers to get through, or if you're resining over something like wood and you want to remove all of the cured resin and take it right back down to the wood. But the most important thing to remember when you're using an electric sander is to hold it flat and let the sander do the work. So don't lean on it, don't hold it on an angle, and don't press down too hard, because that's going to place uneven pressure, which could create deep marks or swirl marks or other issues that you're going to have to get rid of. And it's also important not to sand too long in one spot, because the friction can create hot spots, which could soften the resin. And the other things you'll need are tools to remove the dust and the debris after you've sanded. So you'll need a damp cloth or a paper towel and a soft brush. And if you've got open spaces like bubbles or cracks in wood, you may want a pointed tool, a toothbrush, or a can of condensed air. And to restore the gloss after you've sanded, you'll need some resin and a soft foam brush. And in some cases, you can restore the gloss with car polish and a soft cloth. And of course, you'll need your artwork. So let's start with layering. In other words, you want to add a fresh resin layer to your piece. This could be because you want to paint in between resin layers, or you want to add gold leaf, or maybe it's just because you really like the look of a thick resin coat. Perfect. This is the easiest scenario of them all. So the golden rule is that if your resin is cured, you need to sand. This is a non-negotiable, and it doesn't matter if the resin cured yesterday or it cured last year. If your resin's cured, you need to sand first before you apply a fresh resin coat. Now, the reason for sanding is that you want to scuff up the surface with the sandpaper to create some texture or tooth. The fresh resin layer is going to grab onto that texture and create a really tight bond with the cured resin layer. Now, it's really important to note, if you don't sand down your cured resin, you run the risk of the fresh resin layer separating or delaminating down the road. Now, if you don't want to be bothered with sanding between layers, there is a way around it. You can actually add a fresh layer onto wet resin that's been curing for about 3 to 5 hours. The resin will have thickened up and be quite sticky at that point, which means the fresh resin can easily bond to it and the two layers will cure together. This is especially useful when you're working with molds because it's really difficult to get in there and sand cured resin. So for this piece here, it's cured, so we're going to sand. Now I've got 80 grit sandpaper here, but you can use whatever you have on hand. I mean, I certainly wouldn't go coarser than 80 grit, and I probably wouldn't go finer than 180, but anything in between those ranges will do perfectly. And you could even use a piece of Scotch-Brite if you have it. Now, before I start sanding, I'm gonna make sure I put on my protective dust mask, my safety goggles, and my gloves. Now, I'm not trying to remove any resin here. I just want to scuff up the surface to create that tooth, and that's it. Now, what if you're adding artwork to the cured resin surface before you pour a fresh layer? For example, you might be painting on a design with acrylic paint marker or a brush, or you might be applying gold leaf or collage elements. You don't need to sand these. That art material you just put down is going to provide that tooth you're looking for, and the resin is going to adhere to it really well. But you do have to carefully sand any areas of plain cured resin around your design. So once you've scuffed it up all the way around, including the edges, you'll need to wipe away or vacuum up all of that sanding dust. Then I like to wipe the surface down with a damp paper towel. It doesn't need to be wet, just damp, to get rid of any fine dust. Now, if you use a damp cloth to wipe up the resin dust, it's really important to let the surface dry completely. Resin and moisture do not get along, and if you pour a fresh resin layer onto a damp surface, you could end up with a cloudy cure. So once it's dry, I like to wipe it down one more time, and then we're ready to pour. Now, if you're working on a piece of wood with a hole or a crack, it's handy to use a brush or a can of compressed air to get all the dust out of those nooks and crannies. And if you've sanded to get rid of bubbles, the same thing. A soft toothbrush or a pointed tool can really help remove the fine dust trapped inside the void where the bubbles were. If you don't remove the sanding dust, you could end up with little white dots in your cured piece. Okay, so now we're at the point where you might be questioning your choices. It looks destroyed, it looks a mess, but I promise you, when you pour on the fresh resin layer, it is magical to watch how it comes back to life. Take a look at this. Look at that. Okay, so I hope seeing it in real time sets your mind at ease. We've poured our fresh resin, it looks beautiful once again, so now we're going to cover it as usual and leave it to cure overnight. And tomorrow you will never know it was sanded. So next we'll move on to what is probably the most common reason for sanding, and that is to fix an imperfection in the resin surface. So this could be dust or a bug or a hair that landed in the wet resin while it was curing. It could be dimples all over the resin surface from curing in a cold environment. It could be bubbles on the resin surface or even deep within the resin. It could also be a scratch that occurred long after the resin has cured. Whatever the reason, the only way to fix this is to sand it out and re-pour. So remember with our last sand, we only wanted to scuff up the resin in between layers. This time we actually want to remove resin. So I've got a coarse sandpaper here, 80 grit, because it can move a lot of resin in a very short time. So how you sand all depends on what you're dealing with. If you've got one problem area with like a hair or a scratch and everything else is perfect, you can just sand down that one area and then give everything else a light scuff. But if you've got an all over problem like dimples or bubbles on the entire piece, you're going to want to sand down the entire thing. Now, if you've got an imperfection that's a bit deeper, like a fly or a bubble, you'll need to sand deeper until it's removed. Just remember to keep stopping and checking where you're at. If it helps, you might want to keep a damp cloth on hand to wipe away the sanding dust, just so you can see where you're at a little bit better. So the great thing about resin is that it self-levels, so you don't have to worry about getting an uneven surface because you've sanded deeper in just one area. When you pour the resin on, it'll go where it needs to go. It'll fill in the lowest points first, and then it will even out across the surface. I prefer using a finer grit sandpaper in any areas where there's risk of damaging the artwork. This could be on a piece like this one that has bare spots where the artwork is exposed because of not enough resin, or the piece was knocked out of level and the resin ran off. Take your time, sand carefully and slowly, and you should be good. So one question we get asked all the time is about spot fixing. In other words, if you've just got one problem area, like a piece of dust or a hair in your piece, do you really have to sand the entire piece to fix it? Or can you just sand and re-pour in that one area? Now, this probably isn't the answer that you want to hear, but unfortunately we don't recommend spot fixing for the simple reason that it's really hard to get a nice, seamless finish. If you sand and re-pour in a small area on top of the original resin coat, you will almost certainly see where you patched it. Instead, sanding down the entire piece and re-pouring means you get a nice, uniform, even finish. So now let's talk about sanding down sharp or uneven edges. Now, uneven edges can occur when you don't use stands and your resin pools at the bottom of your piece. And sharp edges can occur when you're pouring into a mold. As the resin spreads and levels out, it can rise up against the edges of the mold, creating a thin raised lip, which can be quite sharp. Now, to fix sharp edges, a lot of artists like to use a deburring tool, which will carve the resin edges off. Now, this tool is really sharp and it's easy to cut yourself if you're using it on resin that's already hardened. It's best only to use it on resin just after you pulled it out of the mold while the resin is still flexible. A deburring tool can also cause rough, choppy edges unless you're really good with it. So I prefer using an emery board and just going around the perimeter, and an emery board is also really great if you've got uneven edges on your resin piece too. Or you can place your piece down on a piece of sandpaper and run it along until it's flush. Just make sure you're sanding in a circular motion and rotate your piece to get a nice even sand. Going back and forth and holding it in the same position could result in an uneven surface. Another option, which doesn't involve sanding at all, is to pour a little resin in the center to fill in that shallow concave. So that can look really nice as well because it gives you a nice domed effect. But keep in mind that this might not be ideal for coasters. Another thing that can happen with molds is that the mold may not have been sitting totally level. And when you pop your resin piece out of the mold and stand it up, it may not sit flat. This one is a pretty easy fix. You can run it along sandpaper until the surface is even. So now that these pieces have been sanded, how do we restore the gloss? Well, there are a couple of different ways. You can use a foam brush and apply a very thin coat of resin. And honestly, you need the tiniest amount. You don't want to apply too much and create any drips. Or you could use a polishing compound like car polish and a soft cloth and restore the gloss that way. And finally, instead of a glossy finish, you may prefer the look of a buttery smooth matte finish on your resin. And you can do this by using progressively finer grits of wet sandpaper and then polishing it to get the exact amount of shine that you want. So to do this, you'll need your finished artwork. You'll need wet sandpaper in a variety of grits. I've got 320, 600, and 1500 here. You'll need a soft cloth and a spray bottled water, and you'll also need your wax. So first, you're going to want to wet the surface and sand it down with 320 grit wet sandpaper. You'll see a paste beginning to form as the sanding residue mixes with the water. When the paste becomes thick and dry, it's time to stop. Spray the surface generously with water and wipe off all of the paste. Then wet the surface again and repeat the process 2 to 3 more times until the surface is perfectly smooth and you can't see any scratch marks. Repeat this process with 600 grit sandpaper, sanding and wiping 2 to 3 times before moving on to the 1500 grit. Make sure the surface is evenly sanded and smooth before moving on to the next grit. If you see scratch marks you can't get rid of, you may need to jump back to the previous grit and sand some more. Once you finish sanding, spray down your piece with water and wipe, repeating until all traces of the sanding residue have been removed. Dry your piece off well. Then, with a dry soft cloth, spread a coat of wax evenly across and rub it in a circular motion to polish your piece. You can use an electric polisher at this point, but be aware that the resin will get shinier and shinier as you polish it. Stop polishing when there's no more haze and when the finish is as matte or shiny as you'd like it to be. And if you want to learn more, we've got a video called How to Get a Matte Resin Finish that outlines all of the steps. So here are the key takeaways when you're sanding resin. The most important is to wear a dust mask to avoid inhaling fine particles. You need to sand cured resin to create some tooth for the fresh resin layer to adhere to. If you're working with art materials like paint, that will also provide that tooth. When you're removing imperfections like dust or bubbles, you want to use an 80 grit sandpaper. If you're simply scuffing up the resin surface, you can use anything from 80 to 120. Make sure you sand deep enough to remove the imperfections, and make sure to remove the dust from bubble holes or cracks in wood. Avoid sanding so deep that you might damage your artwork. Instead, go slow, use a finer grit, especially around areas where the artwork is exposed. Spot fixing is really tough to do. You're better off sanding and repouring the entire surface for a flawless finish. After you've sanded, you can restore the gloss with a thin coat of resin, or you can use car polish and a soft cloth. And if you're looking for a matte finish, work your way up gradually through various grits of wet sandpaper for a smooth, buttery matte finish. Well, I hope you found this video helpful, but if you do have any questions or comments about sanding resin, please leave them in the comments below. Don't forget to hit subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Bye!